Throughout the last 2,000 years, history has recorded a recurring financial pattern that has repeatedly led entire civilizations to erase their accumulated debts through dramatic and often catastrophic resets. The broad details differ from era to era, but the underlying structure remains remarkably consistent. Each cycle begins with a long phase of easy credit, when individuals, governments, and institutions feel confident borrowing more than their economies can realistically sustain. Governments claim progress, and households feel wealthier. Yet beneath the surface, the foundation is fragile because the growth is not rooted in productivity but in credit-driven expansion. This dynamic appeared in multiple societies, including ancient Rome during the early imperial period, medieval Europe in the years preceding the Black Death, France in the decades before the Revolution, and Germany in the chaotic years between World War I and the hyperinflationary collapse of 1923. Especially once borrowing became necessary just to service existing debts. At a certain point in these historical examples, whether the numbers were tracked formally or simply felt through widespread financial pressure, interest payments outpaced economic growth entirely, creating a mathematical boundary from which no society has ever recovered through ordinary policy decisions. Historical leaders often promised that debts could still be repaid through new taxes, new loans, or future expansion, but the underlying arithmetic always overpowered political optimism. As various governments confronted this reality, creditors demanded repayment while debtors pleaded for relief, and societies fractured along economic lines. In each of these cases, the moment arrived when it became undeniable that repayment could never occur. Either the debt burden consumed all available revenue, the currency weakened under the strain of excessive money creation, or political confidence evaporated as people realized the system was insolvent. Once this recognition phase began, pressure for a reset intensified. In ancient Rome, riots and political unrest forced the emperor to intervene with interest-free loans that temporarily propped up the system. In medieval Europe, the collapse of major Italian banking houses triggered widespread defaults, and the arrival of the Black Death disrupted social and financial structures so severely that debts effectively vanished as populations collapsed. In France, the government resorted to printing more assignats, but overuse once quickly destroyed the currency's value, erasing creditor wealth. In Weimar Germany, the government's attempt to meet impossible reparations obligations through monetary expansion led to some of the most extreme inflation ever recorded, wiping out savings and monetary stability in a single year. And in 1953, post-war Europe recognized that Germany's debts were once again unpayable, leading to an international agreement that canceled roughly half the outstanding obligations. All of these events illustrate the same underlying truth. When debt accumulates faster than the productive capacity of a society, the system inevitably resets through inflation, political decree, or widespread destruction. Today, global debt has climbed to levels that mirror the early warning phases seen in those earlier historical collapses. Worldwide liabilities now exceed 3 times global GDP, and the interest owed on this debt surpasses the new economic value created each year. The United States alone is carrying more than $36 trillion in federal debt. As interest payments continue to rise, nearly all real economic growth is being absorbed just to service existing obligations. This places the modern world squarely in the same mid-cycle stages experienced by past societies shortly before their financial resets. As contemporary debt levels grow increasingly unsustainable, the transition into the later stages of this historical cycle becomes clearer. Around the world, policymakers, economists, and ordinary citizens are gradually recognizing that the current debt burden cannot be repaid under any plausible scenario. The mathematics alone make the situation unavoidable. Global GDP grows by only a few $1 trillion annually, while interest on worldwide debt demands several times that amount. Once this mismatch becomes apparent to a critical mass of people, confidence in the system begins to deteriorate. This erosion of trust is visible in modern political movements calling for extensive loan forgiveness, expanded deficits, or sweeping financial reform. In the United States, student loan forgiveness proposals, expanded welfare programs, emergency stimulus packages, and debates about modern monetary theory all reflect this mounting tension between those who owe and those who expect repayment. Internationally, developing nations burdened by debts to wealthier countries or global institutions increasingly signal their inability to pay, while creditor nations quietly acknowledge that many of these obligations exist only on paper. Political polarization increases as different groups argue over how the crisis should be resolved. The pattern observed in previous eras suggests that this is the moment when the final stage approaches the point at which a large-scale reset takes place. Historically, societies resolve such crises in only 3 ways: through sustained inflation that quietly erodes the value of money, through formal cancellation of debts known as jubilees, or through conflict and large-scale destruction that makes the previous financial structure unenforceable. The most likely path in the modern world is a combination of the first two. Persistent inflation can reduce the real value of debt without explicitly declaring default, allowing governments to claim they are meeting obligations even as the currency loses purchasing power. Meanwhile, selective debt forgiveness, particularly for politically significant groups, may emerge as a practical solution to social pressure. Some nations may even negotiate broad restructuring agreements similar to the post-WWII settlements that allowed Europe to rebuild. However, economic history warns that periods of intense financial stress also heighten geopolitical tensions, which can escalate into conflicts that disrupt supply chains, destroy physical infrastructure, and ultimately reset the financial system through sheer force of circumstance. Whether the modern reset arrives through inflation, policy decisions, or geopolitical shock, the outcome remains consistent with historical precedent: the erasure of unpayable debt, the redistribution of wealth, and the emergence of a new financial structure built on the ruins of the previous one. The individuals most affected by these transitions are typically savers, fixed-income earners, and holders of cash or long-term bonds, as their wealth is eroded by inflation or nullified by devaluation. Conversely, borrowers with fixed-rate debt and owners of tangible, productive assets often endure the transition more successfully, as their obligations diminish in real terms while the assets they hold retain or grow in value. What history makes clear is that the cycle always resolves not through repayment, but through transformation. As the world moves further into the final stages of this pattern, understanding these historical dynamics becomes essential for anticipating future developments. The modern financial system, like those before it, is not exempt from the fundamental limitations of mathematics and economic capacity. And just as earlier societies confronted these pressures, the global economy will ultimately experience its own reset, marking the end of this cycle and the beginning of the next.